Kate Mila Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen. We are on video number 4 of our book, The Eden Conspiracy by Paul Wallis. I should read you the subtitle. Ancient Memories of E.T. Contact and the Bible Before God. So we were beginning chapter 9 called Bloodletting, Bluetooths, and Covert Powers. So as is so frequent with Paul Wallis, he jumps around in time as he ties together the threads of this very broad story. So he's in Guatemala in 2023, and he said that there was discovered there a megalithic remains found that covered 6,000 square miles with more than 3,000 buildings so far. This is the Mayan city of Tikal. And just for a little aside here, P.S., talk about synchronicity. I frequently listen to podcasts when I'm doing other stuff, and I recently discovered a really, really good one called, I should look it up, I can get it right, Lost Civilizations, I believe is the official title. Yeah, I don't want to say the wrong thing. The Fall of Civilizations. Fall of Civilizations on any podcast source. And it, the guy is very learned, and it's very well written. And he just discusses civilizations in the past and what we know, if we know what happened to them and how their rise and then their demise came about. And guess which one I'm listening to right now? The Fall of the Mayan civilization. And he talked quite extensively about the city of Tikal. I didn't know about it before that. So weird how that kind of works, isn't it? Anyway, the ruins there really indicate that there was a thriving, it's in the Yucatan Peninsula, a thriving culture. They found ceremonial headgear for the kings and the priests, including one carving with a face in a helmet with a clear visor and what looks like breathing apparatus, and another in some sort of spacesuit. Oh, this must be I want to say Prince Pikal. I could be wrong about that. It very much looks, I didn't realize, I didn't put the two together. Very much looks like the top of a sarcophagus etched in stone. Looks like an astronaut sitting in a cockpit for all the world, including smoke coming out of the bottom and tubes for airlocks, and just really interesting. Of course, they have different interpretations of it, archaeologists, but what do they know? Anyway, the history of Tikal, since we're talking about it right now, you really, really should listen to this podcast, The Fall of Civilizations. I believe it's number 3. I think it's the 3rd episode. Okay, so enormously sophisticated culture, really dramatically sophisticated. We don't know anything about it because they destroyed the conquistadores, destroyed all of their written material. Really a tragedy because they were a very literate civilization. They found lots of gold artifacts, and they found one, I've seen this in pictures of it in a museum, and it looks like a little wasp or a bee or something, except that when aeronautical engineers looked at it relatively recently, they said, well, no, wait a minute. This is not how a wasp or a bee's wings would, this is not an insect. This is some sort of manufactured flying object. So Paul is saying that they now are really regarding these more as the emblems of space flight. And Oh, well, here we go. I guess I read it here. Aeronautical experts say that these are not shaped like animals, but they are very much their wings. The direction and angle and the location and angle and all that kind of thing about the wings is more indicative of some kind of airplane or space vehicle. They do actually, they don't look like wasps. When you really start to think about it, they look like fighter jets. So he's saying that this collected, all these collected artifacts are treasury of a cultural memory. And across the border in Mexico, there's a Mayan city, which, now I'm going to really mispronounce it, Yaxchilan, Yaxchilan. And it's has over 100 structures and monuments still existing. Some have a sequence of limestone carvings, and unfortunately, interestingly, some of these carvings were these blocks with the Mayan pictographs that are their alphabet were taken and used later and used upside down and backwards in the wrong direction, and so it took a very long time to figure out what they were saying. They also depict the ceremony of bloodletting that was meant to alter your state of consciousness, kind of like inducing a near-death experience to alter your sense of reality. This was voluntarily done on the Queen, and the question is, was she drugged first before they did it? And her tongue has been perforated to induce a state of delirium. This is just getting a little much. Anyway, the carvings indicate an alteration to her perceptual field, is what they're showing in an artistic way, leading us to speculate that they engaged in rituals to alter consciousness. For what purpose? Yeah. So other carvings show her in remote communication with a world beyond, and with a dragon-like being associated with her people's ancestry. And these are feathered serpents, which I think we all kind of associate with Mayan culture. This eventually gave birth to the Mayans, and this feathered serpent governed the Mayans in the far past. And this dynasty of nobility that are actually physically related in some way to this feathered serpent is the Jaguar dynasty. They are the successors to dragons. They're the rulers by proxy for the dragons, the dragon being the being from wherever. And they invoke dragon power and authority, and they seek guidance from that being. So this Mayan ritual, it echoes many that Paul said he's seen around the world. He started the book out talking about rituals in a small village, and he says there's just so much parallel or mirrored ritual all over the world. For example, the altered states of consciousness induced to achieve communication with powerful ones of other worlds or previous generations and civilizations that exist in many, many, many cultures. What's it called? Ayahuasca, for example. Mushrooms, psilocybins, for another example. So the name Tikal, what does that mean? It means the place of the voices. And the carved reliefs that they found seem to emit a message that it authenticates the intelligence and the advancement of the Mayan royals and the right for them to rule. This is the message that's being put forward, that they inherited this right both genetically and by the power being given to them. And also, it's not just the royals, but the priests. They kind of go hand in hand, of course they do, of the Jaguar dynasty. So in all the reliefs, the royals wear a headpiece and an earpiece and a mouthpiece that he says, and I would agree, if you look this up, look like Bluetooth devices. He also sees other possible, and he's not just the only one who sees this, other possible technical motifs and symbols. From where? We're talking about really ancient cultures. Where would they get the notion of this? I live in the middle of the 21st century, well, the beginning of the 21st century, and it would never have occurred to me to depict stuff like that. Maybe that's just me. Anyway, why would a thing on a head covering that looks like breathing apparatus or a Bluetooth be equivalent to superiority in a pre-technological world? So Tikal, the place of voices, this suggests communication. How and with whom? Was the bloodletting ceremony, their shamanic rituals, actually mimicking technology that their ancestors had used? But they lost the understanding of how all of that really worked. They don't know how to use it, and it comes down to a bloodletting to induce a change in reality, because maybe they obviously have lost a real factual understanding of what was going on. The Mayan literature, the tiny bit that's still around, hints at this. When they took over, when they marched in and took over, the Spaniards created a bonfire in the middle of, I don't know, the plaza or whatever, maybe the middle of the temple, I can't remember. And every single book or written object they could find, they burned. The Mayans had a very advanced literary culture. They had books made of some kind of paper leaf thing, and they had books made of skin, light skin, and like animal hide, and vellum, for example, like the medieval books, and they had seashell pots of ink. Very tragic. And he said that it had been described, the reaction of the native people as they watched these books being burned. They were just in extreme distress. So now what am I looking up here? I don't even know. I distracted myself. Okay, here we go. So he said the Mayan literature talks of powerful beings, the draconian feathered serpents who colonized and adapted the ancestors of the Mayan people. They first appeared, according to the Mayan literature, hovering over the primordial waters in advanced flying craft. According to the story, they did indeed have advanced technology. The Mayan narrative of the Popol Vuh goes on to detail the textures of the advanced craft, how they appeared when in action in the night sky. And if we consider this cultural memory instead of made-up stories, then things that they have found, emblems they found in Guatemala and Mexico, very well could just be legitimate records of ancient visitors. They have emblems, symbols, shapes that have been carried down culturally. How do we know that these weren't actually evoking the spacecraft emblems? Like astronauts will wear patches, insignia, that kind of thing. They have some very unusual cultural things that have been handed down, and you have to scratch your head and wonder, where did that come from? And he asks, is this all cultural memory? The symbols seen on royalty and in artifacts were claimed to be what they would hold up as, this is our right of succession. The powerful ones, they're the heirs of authority. They're not only in positions of authority because of their birth. They've been given that birthright also. They've been not anointed, but assessed worthy to be the leaders. There are similar equivalents in ancient Judaism too, from 10, is that right? Oh, from the 11th to the 10th century BCE. So, working towards the year 0. So at least, well, a very long time back. And I'm trying to remember the dates of the Mayans. I almost feel like we're in the same ballpark there. The Jaguar dynasty claimed the right to rule from an earlier cultural civilization, a regime that was ultimately from space. So they claim to have direct authority. Some claim the same to the Scottish Stone of Destiny. So there is an apparent link, but this is a link between 8th century Mexico and 21st century England. Isn't that interesting? Remember, Charles borrowed it to get coronated. The same is true with Sumerian kings. There's a long legacy of handing down ceremonial artifacts supposedly from symbolic of the sky. And in Benin, some say it's just a justification, like, oh, look at me, I'm worthy to be the successor because I'm holding the stick. You know, but who's to say? In Israel, Yahweh picked his successors himself, and they continued to hand down their authority even though he'd been rejected. So despite the coup, Yahweh still sort of continued to exert power through his successors, whether they were realizing it or not. But where did that leave the king, like King Saul? Saul refused Yahweh, and he refused Yahweh's scorched earth plans. He won the battle and then brought offerings to Yahweh, so that's odd. Yahweh's deputy, Samuel, tells Saul that because he refused to slaughter everyone on Yahweh's command, Yahweh would not accept his offerings and he would end Saul's reign. Yahweh infects Saul with something that leads to his death at his own hands, like a brain worm. But Saul thought that he was Yahweh's friend. He never fully understood that Yahweh was annoyed. So Yahweh himself appointed David, and this enforced the succession that he decided on. And this is compared to modern English. Okay, England went from many monarchies to just one, and the power was limited by the 1215 signing of the Magna Carta, you know, in the field, King John. But by 1649, Charles I was the king. He was executed, and they abolished the office of king. This is interesting. They've been through a lot of turmoil in the past. They had 11 years as a republic, and then there was a new monarch, Charles II. And in 1688, they changed over to a parliamentary system. Today, the crown appoints the House of Lords and the people elect the commons. The House of Lords, that's just too much. Even today, the prime minister who is elected must be invited to the palace to kneel in front of the king or queen, kiss their hand, and swear an oath of allegiance. Oh, I didn't realize that the English royal family lived at Mar-a-Lago. Anyway, the monarch will be the senior British member of a dynastic family of John William Frisson Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. The Saxe-Coburg-Gothas are the Germanic family that run England. And at the outbreak of World War I, Queen Elizabeth's grandfather, decided that, grandparents, they decided that, oh, you know, it's not a good look to be German right now in the middle of World War I, and our name kind of gives it away. So we're going to change our last name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor. It's not really their last name at all. It's the name of a place, but they adopted that as their last name to seem more English during a time when it was not a good thing to be German. Here we go. Here's the story. In 1917 is when they did this. They changed their last names to avoid their German colonial roots, basically. The prime minister must get permission from the monarch to form a government and must report every week to account for his or her political activity. So when they try to say that they're just symbolic, that's a lie. And the monarch must sign every piece of legislation before it can become law. Only 46% of the parliament is elected. 54% is related to the Windsors or chosen by a Windsor. All must take the oath to a Windsor. So technically, although elected, they could not serve without taking that oath. Therefore, they do not have any kind of a republic. I think it's really important that people know that. That's why I have such disdain that I talk about that is not a popular thing to talk about. It's a sham, is what it is. The only other significant powers still reside with the Windsor family. This includes the power to appoint ministers, to police the public, to exclude the police from Windsor family properties. They're not beholden. The power to deprive members of the public of their liberty, to issue death warrants, to embargo state information, to negate criminal liability, to defend borders, go to war, raise and spend taxes. They can do this unilaterally. Some of these crown powers are delegated or loaned to the prime minister. Others are delegated to police and intelligence services, and some are exercised directly, but they are all officially crown powers. And as such, they fall outside of any democratic control or accountability. He says in his own time, these powers have been used directly by the Crown to amend legislation and in other cases exempt the Crown from new legislation. For instance, in 1968, as a move towards negating endemic racism in the country, the British Labour government under Prime Minister Harold Wilson, Mr. Wilson, brought forward a bill to make it illegal to refuse a person employment on the basis of their ethnicity. This white paper was brought to the Parliament, read to the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and finally passed into law. But only after Queen Elizabeth II had demanded an exemption from this law for all palaces, properties, and estates owned by the family. In those places, all the old ways would continue unabated, thank you very much. And this exemption was far from a one-off. In fact, in the last 55 years of her reign, the late Queen Elizabeth II obtained similar exemptions for her family from 160 pieces of legislation. These exemptions included laws governing animal welfare and workers' rights. In Paul's lifetime, crown powers have been used to refuse police access, avoid legal scrutiny, shut down, just think Prince Andrew, shut down successive police investigations into elite crime, and to depose a democratically elected prime minister on the other side of the world in the Windsor's Dominion of Australia. And this is on page 146, well, starting on 145, 146, and 147 of this book. If you want to review it, I think this is really significant information that's just glossed over. So, where are we here? So in Australia, all real estate property in Australia belongs to the Windsors. All common Australians do is buy the lease on the land. So if you buy a house in Australia, you're really just leasing it from the Queen or the King. At the death of the person, a percentage of the equity in the sale in taxes goes to the Dominion coffer, the pocket of the royal family. But if you die a Windsor with a crown and orb, you cannot be taxed. The Windsor's money is never dispersed. They do not pay. Therefore, the crown powers are far more than ceremonial. They're financial benefit. It's the hidden hand of political interference beneath pseudo-democracy. For example, the crown jewels. They don't belong to the nation. They belong to the crown. And just as a little aside, almost all of them stolen from countries that they invaded and oppressed. So this is the same dynamic of Yahweh's influence. He was removed, but not removed. He approved of the anointing of the king. He received revenue. That's an illusion of social and political change or progress, but it's not real. It's covert government. Corporations globally give big donations to political parties with the expectation of the reward of influence to shape public policy. Elon Musk. Visible leaders may change with elections, but the covert engines of policy remain unchanged. Who was at the inauguration? Let's talk about the Ark of the Covenant. This was like a box thing, and it was carried around, and it represented the right to govern the tribes of Israel. Somehow, big question mark, the Ark facilitated communication between the king and Yahweh, between the throne of power. For the throne of power, it was a communication device. And inside of it was something, and symbols of power. The staff of Aaron, the jar of manna from the desert, remember? And tablets of the law, the Ten Commandments. We did a book by Graham Hancock, The Sign and the Seal, I think it's what it was called, about the Ark of the Covenant, and how there has never been a custodian of the Ark of the Covenant who hasn't died a mysterious sort of blood disorderish, cancerish sort of death after prolonged exposure to the Ark, and the stories that it emitted some sort of deadly energy. And the reason why it was kept in the Holy of Holies, the Sanctum Sanctorum, and nobody was allowed to go in is because it was dangerous. So what was the Ark? Was it merely totemic, symbolic? A cute box to carry things around? Or did it function as a device? Was it technology? It had strange phenomena around it. It created powerful vortices of wind. It emitted what sounds like must have been electricity and radiation. Proximity to it, when it was stolen by the Philistines, destroyed their image of their powerful one, the Dogon, which was semi-aquatic god. It came from the deep past to teach them the Dogon came from the deep past to teach the Philistines agriculture and the building of cities. This is paleo contact in their eyes. And after the statue disintegrated, their city was overrun with rats. The population broke out in tumors. This is the record, the historical record. They got better when they returned the Ark. Also in the Ark was the Urim and the Thummim. This is the esoteric technology used to communicate with Yahweh, from whom they got guidance by using whatever these two things were that we don't really know. Like the Ark of the Covenant itself, these mysterious items embodied an esoteric technology by which ancient Jewish leaders would expect to communicate with Yahweh, receive information, and guidance. Some scholars suggest that the heady cocktail of smokes and oils saturating the air of the inner sanctuary were intended to assist the priest's interaction with the other side by affecting an altered state of consciousness. Yet the Bible's vague language surrounding the purpose of the oils and smokes, and especially around the Urim and Thummim, strongly suggests that neither their priestly users nor the later narrators had any real idea what the objects actually were or how they really functioned. This not knowing strongly suggests two possibilities concerning this mysterious technology. The first is that what the high priests were actually handling was in fact the advanced technology of a previous or extraterrestrial civilization. The second is that, like the Mayan queen's earpiece, the Urim and Thummim were artistic low-tech facsimiles of a remembered advanced communication technology which their ancestors had seen operated in the past by a previous culture or by the powerful ones themselves, a cultural rendition of a memory that had diminished by time. So lots of smoke and incense and oils. Was that an altered state of consciousness? The priests and the descendants of these leaders really didn't know what the objects were or how they functioned. Either they were original high-tech or they were the remembered facsimiles. So the Jaguar dynasty is parallel in this. This is that headset that the queen in Guatemala wore. The right to rule comes from these beings, we'll call them ETs, and this transfer of power is represented by vested objects, symbolic objects. So it's like when you're sitting in a circle at group therapy and you can't talk unless you're holding the talking stick. You have the power and the permission if you're holding the stick. The orb and the scepter, same idea. The ark, same idea. Or is there more to it? So both of these cultures were comparing the Mayans and the ancient Israelis culture. They expected their rules to be on behalf of these dragon beings, and the priests of both cultures would communicate with these entities using altered states and esoteric technology. Human owners never really knew how the items really worked. They existed, they were in the temple, for example, but nobody really knew what was going on there. Political significance of these objects is clear. The earthly kings and the high priests were positioned as the holders or the proxies for Yahweh. The cult of Yahweh defined public policy with punitive action. Yeah, so really that was the political office. That was who was in charge. The real line of succession, the leadership. Replacing leaders doesn't mean the power changes hands. Hence, the Queen of England or the King. The former despot in possession of vested objects and the right to do to other people whatever, the land, property, the people themselves, they get this from the holding of these objects. Not literally holding, although it can be literally holding it, but the possession of them. In these ways, the dynamics of government established by the old regime are able to persist under the appearance of a new leader. And, tax and money goes back to them, too. That's always handy. So our ancestors understood these dynamics of abuse of leadership, and they knew the principles of covert government. Nobody was fooled. I think we're more fooled than they were, maybe. They knew that the hidden hands in geopolitics, and they knew who the non-human involvement was in that layer of government. So they told us, passed it down in stories and sagas. These so-called lore, so-called mythologies were political education in the hopes of sparing their descendants from ignorance and suffering. But this ancient wisdom has been redacted, burned, translated wrong out of existence. But the message can be found if you keep paleo contact in mind as the context while you're reading the texts. But if you call Yahweh God, it completely changes the whole narrative. So what he's saying is you need to make a choice. Who are you going to believe? status quo conventional or your own lying eyes. In other words, if you take the actual accurate translations, Yahweh is no longer God. Yahweh is a being from space. It's difficult to argue that. The Jewish monarchy was founded, and the Yahweh was sent away. And this whole concept that he was gone and now the monarchy was in charge, was never questioned. But for the 3 millennia since, the implication of this has been God is not to be questioned. This is the foundational decision to believe that this is the translation, the accurate translation. This is the decision that which established from that time to this, that God is permitted to do, in the words of the early church father, Origen, such things as we would not believe of the most savage and unjust of men. In other words, the behavior of Yahweh, without us even flinching or considering for an instant that he was doing anything wrong. If we choose to accept this editorial gloss, then we have essentially surrendered our own mind and our own conscience. Today, readers can make up their own minds. Judge for yourself. Is the extreme violence of the character Yahweh the holy activity of a divine, holy, H-O-L-Y, activity of a divine, transcendent being, or is it the brutalism of a psychopathic colonizer? Paul has challenged friends. One he calls a fiery preacher that he loves to talk with about the violence of Yahweh, and Paul challenges him on this because this pastor guy likes to preach from the pulpit about it. But he's been challenging him, and he's also been challenging the pastor of a megachurch. His name is Carrie, who has had paranormal experiences and believes we are not alone in the cosmos. So how does he hold on to his faith and his paranormal experiences at the same time? He's afraid to share with his congregation what's happened to him. He's preaching this Yahweh stuff, but it's been challenged in his private life. This friend of his who's a pastor with a megachurch, because he's had paranormal experiences. So, chapter 10, Enter the Destroyer. Santa Barbara, California, January of 2023. I abbreviated everything because I thought, I can remember that. So, Carrie, his friend, tells Paul that if he challenges the Bible, he'll lose his relationship with his congregation. These are difficult ideas to present to the majority of true believers. It's very difficult to challenge people's core belief. And that's why a lot of theologians and preachers, the head of the Vatican, they know this stuff, but they don't push it publicly because they know what the reaction would be. Carrie's church is charismatic, so, very, very fundamentalist, and it has doctrinal boundaries, very restrictive of the limits of their beliefs and practices. He says, pastors learn to bite their tongue. Young ones quickly see that they will not go far. They can't share what they've learned in seminary about the Bible. They'd lose their jobs. So you progress in the profession by your willingness to repeat the doctrinal norms of the group, as long as you continue to perpetuate the misrepresentation. He says his friend Carrie would lose his ability to be taken seriously, and it's a huge church, it's a mega church. Paul points out that your congregants, he says to him, belong because they love how Jesus presents God, and you can point out how it's incompatible with the immorality of the Old Testament Yahweh. This is half the struggle in convincing people. Try every time a conflict between accepted Bible and what you now know arises. Leave it hanging as a question. So if you believe these teachings of Jesus, how do you justify this malicious, angry Yahweh who told them to kill everybody in this tribe and kill everybody in that tribe? So this gives people permission to explore it for themselves. You're not telling them, you're asking them a question. The incompatibility of the Old Testament stories will be obvious and do the work for you, he says. Leave the dissonance unresolved. Just let them sit with it. However, Paul fears that the persistence of the old paradigms, it's strong, right? When will we reach a tipping point, he asks? When will all of the theologians and pastors in the know feel able to come out? So the question needs to be asked. When did our ancestors wish to teach us, what did our ancestors wish to teach us through their descriptions of ancient contact and colonization? Presumably, they wanted to equip us to avoid the pain of the past and to chart a better future. The stories we have touched on in the last couple of chapters hint at powerful psychological and socio-political lessons which we might have applied more confidently and more universally for more than 2 millennia if only the redactors, the translators, had not obscured these lessons and hidden them from us. Powerful socio-political lessons. He appreciates being able to take differing views and to debate and discuss with his friend Carrie, and his friend Carrie's civil about it. We respect each other as seekers of the truth and understanding. So his chat with him leads Carrie to ask huge questions. Is God even in the Bible? And Paul says, well, Yahweh is not God, and Yahweh is apparently a physical being, but redactions have associated Yahweh with the Creator. But the idea of Yahweh as God, as the source of the cosmos, or the Father in heaven being the phrase that Jesus talked about, not saying it was Yahweh, but speaking of a Father in heaven. This is not the same as the Almighty God of Jewish and Christian belief from 2,000 years. So there's a division, there's an actual time break between the words of Christ in the New Testament saying this benevolent, all-loving Father in heaven, and before that, the angry, vengeful, vindictive, scary, psychopathic being of Yahweh. And they're not the same thing. There are those who will tell you they are the same. They're not the same thing. The Hebrew Bible doesn't even have a word for Almighty. That's interesting. Carrie says that there are tons of references to Almighty God, and Paul doesn't argue. I mean, he agrees with that. But he says this concept of Almighty is problematic. If this God they're talking about is so almighty, so great, why doesn't he fix all our problems? I could give him a little advice on where to start. So what he says is, when we survey the horrors of human life at its darkest and most depressing, we have to ask, what kind of all-powerful entity would stand by and let things happen which are too horrendous to even speak about, let alone for people to experience? It's the question of suffering with which believers have wrestled all through the ages. These questions are inescapably thrown up by this idea of God as an almighty being. So his friend Paul says to his friend that it comes down to semantics and how you translate, and he believes the references to the Almighty are a deliberate mistranslation of the words El Shaddai. And the authority on translating all of this says it is still uncertain what El Shaddai really means. His friend Don Henry Waynesboro, I think that's right, is a biblical translator, and he helped Paul to figure out the way the word morphed through translation over time and what the original meaning may have been in the New Jerusalem Bible. Other sources leave words untranslated. Elohim, Eligon, El Shaddai, and Yahweh. Dom Henry's work is very transparent about the translation issues, and Paul discusses the linguistics in this book of why his ideas are not so unusual. For example, Dom Henry translates Almighty God. He says this is inaccurate. That's not what it says. The meaning is actually uncertain. They're attributing El Shaddai. They're saying, oh, that means the Almighty God. And these experts are saying, no, we don't know what it means. It seems to be related to some place in Mesopotamia. El Shaddai is the word that just implies powerful one from the mountains. These entities were often particular to given geographical areas, different ones to different locations. Joshua asks, whom shall you serve? Because there are choices. He asks the people, whom shall you serve? Because you have choices of who are going to be your powerful ones. In Daniel, a messenger says, a mysterious messenger appears in Daniel's apartment and tells him, I had a terrible time getting here because I had to go into battle with the powerful one of Persia. Not just the powerful one, the one and only. No, the one that's particular to Persia. Powerful one will be known to his own area and to the people of that area, and there's a multiplicity. And this has continued globally throughout history. The king, the lord, the squire owns the people on his land, and the powerful entities were in charge of the people in a particular area. He believes that this originated with non-human governance over our ancestors, the Elohim, and each ET got their earth assignment, lands and the people, from El Elgon. Syrians believed El Shaddai was a real power in the mountains of Syria. The root of Shaddai is the verb to act with violence, to ruin, to destroy. El Shaddai and Yahweh tells Abraham, because they're using this interchangeably, tells Abraham to walk before me and be blameless. In other words, watch your step. The crux of the interchange between Abraham and Yahweh is this message. It's psychopathic, Paul says. With one hand I will protect you, and with the other I will punish you. No one will benefit you as much as I can, as long as you please me. On the other hand, nobody can protect you from me if you displease me. From the get-go, Abraham understands both the dark and the light of a being who, on the one hand, promises progeny and prosperity, while on the other hand, demands unfailing obedience from his own people and nukes the cities of others. When redactions took the translation, El Shaddai became Almighty. But the stories about El Shaddai were about something entirely different. Before they were recrafted to be about God, they were violent and vengeful. Paul advises returning to the root words if you're going to figure out what the real meaning of the Bible is. Before retranslating anything, analyze the old beliefs through a fresh lens. Paul advises incremental steps, and he turns to Mauro Biglino, the guy in Rome, who was in charge of linguistics. His advice is don't translate these undefined words. Use the original and see where the narrative takes you. It provides a very different perspective from the modern reinterpretations. We're assigning meanings when we really don't have that ability. Carey, his friend, sees it being too difficult to to convince regular church goers, you know, just to talk to ordinary people in a church congregation of a Sunday. You're willing to listen to this. I'm willing to listen to this. Most theologians know this, but ordinary people just doing their duty, going to church on Sunday, they don't want to hear this. So people expect pastors to have all the answers, the definitive answers. They don't want to hear stories about ETs. So Paul recommends highlighting the Old Testament passages of Yahweh acting badly, and the New Testament with Jesus disparaging Yahweh. That if you really want to have these conversations with people, get yourself familiar with, you know, be able to cite chapter and verse, because that's very persuasive for people who are into the Bible. And they says that, you know, just say, well, you know, in Kings, Yahweh did this. And in the Gospel of whoever, or the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said this. And just, what do you think of that? And let people sit with this. Let them think about it. Carrie agrees. Use original terms. Don't redact. So don't translate. You can use the original old whatever language word. And don't retranslate it. Let the text tell its own tale. So we're going to stop here just because of the division in the book. This is the end of this chapter. And we'll be starting with chapter 11 next time. So go now and sit with this information and let it speak for itself. I think it's fascinating, and I hope you do too. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, Slán go fóill, slánte.